Hi, everybody. My name is Roy, and I currently serve at Grace Point Berkeley in our Element Middle School ministry. In some capacity or another, I've been giving messages at church full time for around the past 7 years, which is sort of a long time for a guy who used to be like deathly afraid of public speaking. But welcome to this workshop on giving simple Bible studies. If you're here, I'm guessing you're a Christ follower who really wants to share the good news of Jesus with other people. And a lot of us, I think, came to faith through something like a Bible study, But I'm personally kind of ambivalent about that term, Bible study, because you see, I grew up in a non-Christian household, and I was actually a staunch atheist all through high school. So it's true that I did not like Bible or study. And the only reason I showed up was I met this friendly guy who, invited me to come out and eat some free food. And after I ate the free food, I felt like, I felt bad if I were just to take off, and so I stayed for the Bible study. But boy, am I glad I stayed, because what I heard that night made me want to come back the next week and the week after that and the week after that. And so week after week, I would come to Bible study as an atheist to hear the Word of God, because somebody was able to explain it to me and show me that the Bible is full of wisdom and insight, and was telling me stuff about purpose and meaning and life and relationships and even my own soul, like things that were way more important and relevant than anything I was learning at school. So I know a lot of us had an experience like that, and we want our friends and family to experience that as well. But since not all of them might be willing to come to a Bible study, sometimes we have to bring the Bible study to them. So this workshop is kind of a crash course to help you prepare a simple Bible study. Now, generally speaking, there's 4 steps to preparing any Bible study. Well, first, you have to study the Bible yourself, right? And note any interesting points that you might be able to draw out of the text. And then you develop those points and what else can be said about that particular idea or principle. After that, you want to organize your content into some structure that kind of makes it easy to understand and relate to. Finally, you want to practice what you prepared. So here we go. First, you got to study the text. And in a way, this is basically what most of us have been doing during our devotion times, when you read a passage from the Bible and you try to take notes of, whatever unusual or interesting points that you might want to think about and talk about more, right? What general principles or ideas or lessons can we draw from the specific events we see in the text? Now, one way to do that, to come up with those ideas, is to ask the 5W and 1H question. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Of course, not every question is going to lead to an interesting observation, but trying to find insights is a little bit like mining. You go through a ton of dirt because it's totally worth it to find that one nugget or gem of wisdom or idea. All right. Another way to spot something is to remember that the Bible authors often try to help us out, right, by repeating certain words or phrases and ideas that they really want us to lock into and focus on. Remember, back then they didn't have bold or underlining or highlighting for text, and so the only way to really emphasize an idea was to repeat it. So be on the lookout for those. Now let's try this out with a text that's familiar to a lot of us, the story of Jesus calming the storm in Mark chapter 4. So I'll read this out for us, and let's see what we can get out of this story together. So Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" All right, so to study this text, you might start off by asking a few questions about it. So you might say, what happened on this particular boating trip? Well, it seems like the disciples encountered this great windstorm. That's in verse 37. And, since it sort of went south, whose idea was it to go on this boating trip? Well, it turns out it was Jesus' idea to cross the sea to the other side. That's verse 35. And what was Jesus doing during all the action? He was sleeping. That's verse 38. And how did the disciples respond? Well, it seemed pretty clear they were like freaking out because they were scared for their lives and kind of actually blaming Jesus for sleeping. That's also verse 38. And when did the disciples ask Jesus for help? It seemed it was when the situation was kind of critical and the waves were already breaking into the boat and filling it up. So that's 37. And how did Jesus respond to all this? So he calms the storm and then he turns and asks the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" That's 39 and 40. And what was the disciples' conclusion at the end of this whole episode? It says they were filled with great fear and they were asking themselves, who is this? Who is this guy? Right? Also, you might have noticed that the word great appears in this text 3 times. So first there was a great storm. And then after Jesus rebuked the wind, there was a great calm. And finally, the disciples were filled with great fear. So, it's probably not a coincidence that these three all appear in the same story. So I might just like jot that down and make a note of that. Now, I just want to point out again that not every observation question will lead to something really insightful. For example, you might have asked the question, what was Jesus sleeping on? The answer to which is, well, a cushion. Now, if you then went off and started asking yourself, what kind of cushion was it and how did it get there? That's probably not a very fruitful line of inquiry. Now, how you would know that it's not very fruitful, it's actually a matter of discernment, which is just something you sort of develop over time. But, if it's a point that you've like never heard in any Bible study on this text, then it's probably a good chance it's not something you want to like pursue too much. And so actually digging up your old Bible study notes is also a good source of ideas and points, as well as reading up on some good commentaries. So now that you have some interesting observations about the text, try to see what the point or idea is that you want to focus in and talk about. So from the first 2 observations, we can see that following Jesus sometimes meant following him into like a great windstorm. So the point might be that being a Christian doesn't mean you're spared from the storms of life. In fact, Jesus might lead you smack into the middle of a crazy situation. Now, why would Jesus want to do such a thing? That would be something you'd want to think more about. Now, from observations 3 through 5, you might kind of paint this picture of the disciples scrambling on deck for their lives, but not wanting to disturb their tired master at first, but when the situation developed to like a critical stage, suddenly turning on him with this bitter and blaming tone. Don't you care that we're all about to die? And maybe there's something here about the need to like, ask for help a little earlier. And also, it seems so intuitive for us to try to find fault and blame, even though it doesn't help the situation, and even in a situation when our lives are under threat, right? So there's a lot you could also say about Jesus' response when he says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" It seemed like Jesus was like a little bit disappointed in the disciples, that maybe by this point he had expected a little more faith in him. And what did he mean by faith? Faith was probably not like a sense of total serenity in the midst of a huge storm, but maybe at least some trust in Jesus' heart and motives, enough faith to not assume that Jesus didn't care for them at all. And it's also interesting that Jesus' response seems to juxtapose faith on the one hand against fear and not doubt. So fear is what defeats faith, and that's a truth you can further unpack and explore. And if you look at the repetition of great storm, great calm, great fear, maybe a point you can talk about is that following Jesus feels much more like a roller coaster ride. It's anything but dull and boring. So you can see from the disciples' conclusion as well that, you might think that you know somebody after a long time, and you would still be surprised when some situation arises that reveals something about them you never knew before. And the occasion for that discovery was this terrifying event, which, the storm, like in retrospect to the disciples, must have seemed tame compared to the mind-blowing realization that the carpenter sleeping in their boat is actually like an X-Men. He has command over the forces of nature. Now, there's a ton more we could say about this passage, but let's just move on to step 2, to develop the points. Now, when you have a good point or principle, there's generally 3 things you can do with that. You can explain what the point means, you can persuade people that this idea or principle is true, or you can apply the point to their lives. Another way to think about this is to try to answer these 3 basic questions. What does this mean? How is it true? And why does it matter? So, going back to our example, let's say we focus on the point about fear versus faith. Jesus said, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" First, let's explain what does that mean. It seems to mean that fear is the opposite, the enemy of faith, which is a little surprising because most people might think the opposite of faith is like doubt or reason or arguments and evidence. And you can further explain how this comes out through the story. Because you could imagine asking the disciples, on like a calm day at the beach, whether like, hey, theoretically, if there was a big windstorm, do you think Jesus would care enough about you to like do something about it? And I bet they would all say, oh yeah, for sure. Jesus is always looking out for us, man. He's a powerful guy. I'm sure he would be able to keep us safe somehow. But then when the waves were swamping the boat and they feared for their lives, the disciples had a very different response. So after explaining this idea, you should try to persuade people that this is not just something they should accept just because it's like from the Bible, but you need to show that this is really true to life, right? These are truths that match with reality. So build the case that the Bible's insight fits with reality. Here it helps to bring in an example or an illustration. One that C.S. Lewis uses in Mere Christianity is the example of somebody going into surgery. A normal person would be convinced by the doctor that they need surgery and that, the doctor's going to put you down with anesthetic drugs and that, you're going to go to sleep, you won't feel anything, you'll wake up, it'll be all over, right? But then the same person who understood those ideas in his head when he's lying on the cold operating table and the surgeon's about to clamp that mask down on their face, they might panic and freak out all the same. And in that moment, what defeats their faith in the doctor is not that, some knowledge that the anesthetic drugs is, don't work or, evidence and reason to that effect. In fact, all the scientific data about drugs and anesthesiology would tell them that the drugs work fine. But what defeats their faith is fear. It's this irrational emotion that kind of comes over them in the moment. You can also share your own story if it applies about how you might have experienced fear defeating faith. A lot of people have a crisis of faith not because they were shown persuasive arguments that, God doesn't actually exist or that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. But often what rocks our faith and hinders us from trusting God is stuff like fear, like FOMO, fear of missing out, or fear of like life passing you by if you commit to the cause of Christ and you cancel your life plans for your career. It's fear of disapproval from friends or family if they found out, wow, you're like a real Jesus freak who actually takes the Bible seriously. It's fear of unemployment. If I put God first and I don't spend every waking hour building my resume, what if I can't get a job in this economy? So at this point, your example might actually lead into an application for the audience you have in mind. And of course, you should tailor the application to the person or the people you're talking to as much as possible. And for somebody who's really close to maybe making a decision for Christ, the application might be to just help them see that their remaining hesitation about becoming a Christian is probably not a matter of intellectual doubt, but it's an emotional or fear issue. And once you have an idea of how this point could apply to your audience, that brings you to the next stage of your preparation, organizing the content. Now you want to organize these talking points into a format that's easy to follow and makes the content relatable and engaging. Now, not every message or talk has to sort of follow the same format, and especially if you're engaged in a conversation, then don't be like sticking to a rigid outline or script or anything like that. But here's kind of a general format that works really well and maintains a conversational tone or quality, even if you're doing most of the talking, right? So this format is called me, we, God, you, we. Unfortunately, that doesn't like make up a really nice acronym or anything like that, but let me break that down for us. So the intro section is called me. And here's where you lead off with a personal example of something that happened in your life that kind of exemplifies the point you're going to talk about. Then you go into the we section, which is where you broaden out your experience to say, haven't we all encountered the same thing? This establishes common ground with the listener and makes it more likely that they're going to lean in and feel like what you have to say next is not just important to you, but really relevant to them. Then the meat of the talk is the God section, where you introduce the Bible text and what God might have to say about this life situation. After that, you transition to the you section, where you apply the point or idea in a concrete way and you challenge your listener to act on it, or maybe the application is just for them to change their perspective. Finally, you can close with another we section. But this time, you're casting kind of an inspirational vision about what could happen if we all obeyed God and lived out this truth. So going back to our sample text in Mark chapter 4 about that point of fear versus faith, you might want to open with like a story about how you recently experienced this tension. Maybe like, the other day I had to get my wisdom teeth pulled. And the dentist told me, it's going to be fine. We'll put you under, you count to 10, and next thing you know, you'll wake up and it'll all be over. And it sounded like a great deal at the time, but then the day of the procedure came and everything was happening exactly like the dentist said it would, but I suddenly got really scared, like, what if the drugs don't work and I end up feeling everything they're gonna do to me? And I felt this instinctive urge to just rip off the mask and run out of there screaming my head off. Thankfully, I didn't do that, but it took a lot more self-control than I thought to just stand on the table and, take in those deep breaths, right? And I realized in that moment my faith in my dentist was about to fail. And it was not because I found out like, oh, he's not a real dentist or any like rational reason like that. My faith was about to be defeated by fear. Now, we've probably all had experiences like that when even the most rational of us fall prey to some irrational fear, like fear of insects that are like 1,000 times smaller than you, or fear of flying, or any number of things that we know we probably should not fear. But it's really easy to kind of lose our head when we're afraid, and that's exactly what happened to the disciples during a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, at this point, you would read the Bible text and talk about Jesus' response, how he seemed a little disappointed. They still had no faith, no trust, because he had hoped the disciples' past experiences with him would have assured them of his love and commitment to them by now. And applying that experience to our life, when we're in the grip of some fearful situation, we need to remember that what shakes our faith is probably not any rational, reasonable evidence, but in the face of that very strong emotion of fear, we need to hold on to what we once knew to be true about God's goodness and love. So what might be a fearful situation for you right now, which causes you to doubt God's goodness? Or maybe what's keeping you from trusting God with your whole life? Maybe you can see that it's not really actually any intellectual arguments or evidence against God, but it's a fear of the unknown. What would it be like if I actually made Jesus Christ my Lord? Now, if all of us can remind each other to hold on to what we once knew to be true, we can help one another push back against that fear to do not only what is right, but what is best for us in the end, by trusting God and his very good intentions for our lives. Now, once you have a pretty good idea of what you want to say, it's always great to practice saying that a few times. Whether you're going to speak in front of 1,000 people or just one person, it's always a good idea to practice. Now, a lot of people like transcripting or writing down what they plan to say word for word, and that's okay. But you do have to be mindful that most people do not talk the same way that they write. So if that's you, you might find that the sentences that you crafted and look good on paper sounds kind of awkward or stilted when you actually deliver it. And the only way to discover that ahead of time is to practice saying them out loud. So whether you like to just write out some bullet points or you want to write down stuff word for word, you definitely want to practice saying it out loud. And for oral communication, you want to remember the 4 P's for effective communication: pitch, pace, pause, and punch. Now, depending on the setting, not all of these may apply, but generally it's important to vary your pitch. Do not be monotonic, because it will help people stay more engaged if you vary your pitch. Now, about pace, for most people, it's generally better to talk faster. Your audience can listen about 4 times faster than most people can talk. And when you're able to speed up, everything just is less draggy and just sounds better. Now, having said that, knowing when to pause or slow down is also very important. It's a way to signal to a listener that something's worth paying extra attention to. And related to that is the final P, punch. How to punch out and emphasize your point, making it memorable and effective. Now, a technique for adding punch to your message is something we've actually already talked about: repetition. But you cannot just literally repeat yourself word for word, which is why some people have said that preaching is artful repetition. Now, to repeat yourself artfully, you just have to find different ways of saying the same thing. In other words, do what I'm doing now, communicating the same ideas with different phrasing. For example, after saying fear is what defeats faith, you can repeat yourself by saying, What prevents us from trusting God is often not our reason, but our emotions. And at a later point, you can further emphasize by saying, faith is the art of holding on to what we once knew to be true, in spite of our changing moods. Now, if like most people, you find yourself having a really hard time restating these ideas on the fly, this is something you definitely want to practice and maybe script out a few ways to punch out the main point or idea. So there you have it, 4 steps to preparing a simple message. Study the text, develop your points, organize your content, and practice your delivery. I hope these tips can get you started on preparing your own message to share the gospel with someone in your life. Thank you.